Welcome to Behind the Research, where we take you into the thinking, methods, approach, and even what we decided to cut from various episodes of Taste and CTV. Now, if you don't know what Taste and CTV is, head to our website, drinkoffering.tv or drinkoffering.com, and you can enjoy over 100 episodes from around the Bible lands where we take you in depth into the people and personalities, the culture, the humor, and history of the Bible, often with very different perspectives than what you may be used to. The reason? We want you to crack into the research. We want you to dig deep and look at the Bible as real history with real people. And with it, today we are doing something very different. This is going to be a long video, as you can tell, because we're doing something you see a lot on YouTube right now, which is a tier system. We're doing a ranking of who? The kings of the Bible. Why is this perhaps an interesting little research project that you yourself can do? Because we tend to look at the kings binary, don't we? They were a good king, or they were a bad king. That's it. But these are three-dimensional real people. You could have a good king that was very spiritual who had terrible foreign policy or domestic policy. And so we're going to crack into that. We're going to go deep into almost all of the kings of the Bible. And how are we ranking them? Well, we have 5 categories that it's going to be based on. Foreign policy is worth 10 points. So how did they conduct wars? How did they defend the borders? What was their foreign policy like and diplomacy? Domestic policy is next, also 10 points. What was it like being a citizen under this king? Were you starving to death, ravaged by plague, or did they kind of have the domestic policy under control? What about spiritual policy? That's 20 points, double. Why? Well, the Mosaic Law was tied to spirituality. So the more spiritual the king, then the more likely the citizens were to benefit. This was effective policy. And finally, reputation is worth 10 points. So how were they viewed by their contemporaries, by the kings that followed? Were they mourned at their death and given a state funeral, or did everyone rejoice? So reputation will count for 10 marks. That gives us 50, and of the 50 points, they will then be ranked on one of 5 tiers. They will either be a great king, an effective king, an average king, a king that was not effective, or a failure of a kingship. I invite you to follow along, grab a piece of paper and a pen or spreadsheet, cup of coffee, tea, whiskey, wine, whatever you like. Buckle up, do your own list as we go, see where you rank these kings as well. And I will note that there are some kings that we are skipping. And that's any king that reigned for less than 4 years. Simply put, we don't have enough information to put them on the list. So that means we will not be talking about Abijah, Ahaziah, Ammon, Jehoaz, or Jehoiachin from the kings of Judah. And from Israel, we will not talk about Nadab, Elah, Zimri, Tibni, Ahaziah, Zechariah, Shallum, or Pekahiah. I mean, Zimri reigned for 7 days. What are we supposed to say about that? Just put him as a failure and we'll save ourselves 5 minutes. Otherwise, let's have some fun. We are going to start with the United Monarchy going in order. That means we're starting with King Saul. So where do you put Saul on the list? Well, I put him as a great king, top tier. You might be surprised. You might have had him lower. Maybe you had him as a failure. No, it wasn't a failure. Here's why. Foreign policy, perfect marks. Perfect marks. This guy inherited the throne during a crumbling nation. Everyone was divided. You think of the Judges period, how many civil wars there were and near genocides of tribes. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's the theme of the Judges. And now it's thrown on the plate of Saul after the nation rejected Samuel's kids as reigning over them. And what does he do? Well, he recaptures the tribal land of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh in 1 Samuel 11. This was a big deal. If you combine what we know in the Bible with Josephus, with the possibly omitted paragraph from the Dead Sea Scrolls that was found, it seems like Nahash of the Ammonites had conquered basically all the tribal land of the Israelites on the other side of the river. Saul's first week in office, he unites the nation and captures it all back. Not only that, he doesn't just get their land back. He pushes the borders outward To the north and to the east, he captures Zobah, he captures Hamath, he captures the Hagrites. In 1 Chronicles 5 and 10, it tells us that Reuben's land extended east and north, east of Gilead and north towards the Euphrates. Now, sometimes ones go, well, no, it's the desert before the Euphrates, didn't go to the Euphrates. No problem. He captured Hamath, so he still had to the Euphrates. We don't like giving Saul credit for this. We give him a bad reputation. But the reality is, this map that we see of David's kingdom and Solomon's kingdom is only possible if Saul captures Hamath and Zobah. Thank you, Saul. What about on the south? Well, thank you, Saul, again. He conquered the Amalekites to oblivion. He conquered the Edomites, meaning he's the one that extended the borders to the Red Sea in the south, to Eloth. So he also pushed back against the Philistines time and again, kind of kept them at bay, and he seemed to have subjugated Moab. The only thing that may not have happened under his watch was the absorption of the Geshurites and Maccathites. However, it could have happened under his watch, which we'll get into with David. But either way, amazing foreign policy. This guy did what Joshua could not do. So, perfect marks. Domestic policy, near perfect mark. He loses a point, I'll tell you why, and it's not because of David. He united the tribes for war. Just uniting the tribes. As a Jew, I can tell you, getting Jews to agree on something is a fantastic domestic policy. So he did that. But we also see that 1 Samuel 14:52, he used conscription effectively. It was based on merit. He wasn't just grabbing people and throwing them in the army. He waited to see someone that was strong or courageous and recruited them. You'll note that Saul is not a warrior. Saul isn't really the guy fighting with the sword in hand, so to speak. He's more the commander. He's organizing and coming up with the strategies and the plan and then looking for the best guy to execute that plan. This is Saul. He's the brains behind the operation. But we notice he wasn't demanding of luxuries or taxes like some of the later kings were. He did seem to build a big palace in Gibeah for himself, but I mean, he's the king. You need a capital, you need a palace for the king. But he didn't overly use conscripted labor and forced labor. He was a people pleaser. This was his spiritual downfall, was he put people ahead of everything else. He was consumed with this idea of national loyalty. This is why he went after David a lot. David was a threat to his loyalty. Like, he was worried, like, boy, this guy's going to usurp me as king. We can't have another civil war. That's why he was always after David. But he loses a domestic policy mark because of the Gibeonites, which may have happened under his watch or maybe after he was dead with Ishbal, his son. Not quite sure, but he's losing a mark anyways because he would have sown the seeds. The Gibeonites seem to have been near genocided. We don't know why, and we don't know why the whole nation, including David, turned a blind eye to this for decades. But they did, and God punished David for not doing anything about this later. But Saul's still losing a point for it. Spiritual policy, he gets good marks, not fantastic. People will probably put him a lot lower because of killing the priests at Nob. I don't. Good job. Good job, Saul. I'm clapping. I'm slow clapping for you. A lot of credit. That took a lot of chutzpah. Why? 1 Samuel 3:13. The house of Eli is never to be atoned for. How can a priest atone for other people when they're not to be atoned for? So these priests at Nob had no right to continue as priests because they were of the line of Eli. They were supporting Saul's enemy. The priests were supposed to be working in tandem with the kingship, and they clearly were not. So Saul basically executed the prophecy. So no one else seemed to condemn him for this, so I'm not going to condemn him for this. Now, we see that he sacrificed for the nation time and again. Sometimes this was overstepping his role in presumptuousness. He wouldn't wait for Samuel and he sacrificed, but he was always sacrificing. When the nation started eating blood and was sinning for this, what did he do? He stopped everybody, he said, bring them to me. I'm going to sacrifice and I'm going to personally butcher your meat for you so we don't have this. He was very concerned about spirituality. Now, we go, of course, he goes to the witch, the witch of Endor. Yes, but what happened prior to that? He is desperately trying to get an answer from God, and he can't get an answer. So he's pursuing God time and time again, even though he's been rejected by God. So much so that he goes to a witch to try and just talk to anyone who will listen to him. And this goes to his mental illness, okay? I'm not going to hit him hard on his spiritual policy because he was schizophrenic, severely schizophrenic. You look at these accounts of music therapy being used. David playing the harp soothed him. This is schizophrenia. The fact that the Bible says a few instances that he behaved as a prophet, that one of the times where he throws a spear at David, just prior to that, he was acting like a prophet. What does that mean? The prophets tend to be babbling and talking to someone that you couldn't see, right? They're talking to God. So if Saul is talking to someone in the room that doesn't exist, they could go, wow, he's like a prophet. Or he's losing it. He's seeing a hallucination of somebody telling him, Saul, David, he's going to kill you if you don't kill him first, right? I'm not going to hit Saul hard on his spiritual policy and reputation because of a severe, unmedicated mental illness. 1 Samuel 15:35, we sometimes point to that God regretted making him king. This will come back again later, so we'll set it up now. This idea of regret in the Bible is not how we view regret today, this idea of, I made a mistake. God's not saying he made a mistake to make Saul king. The Hebrew word that's used there for regret is this idea of pity. God looked at the situation Saul was in and was like, what a shame. Boy, what a pity that Saul finished like this. He's such a great guy. Isn't it too bad that this is how it ends for him? So that's what God is saying. It's like, it's such a shame that this is how it ends for such a nice guy. Reputation, 8 out of 10. Good marks. Why? Okay, you might want to remember him as jealous and envious and murderous. Okay, he received 2 coronations. The only king to receive 2 coronations. The only king to receive 2 state funerals and burials. The only king to have a national dirge written about him. And Josephus, by the 1st century, still he was regarded as a brave and noble leader. And even his suicide, like his death on Gilboa, was viewed as an honorable death. People risked their lives to get his body and give him a proper burial. So he was a great king. Great king. Don't worry, we're not going to spend as much time on the other kings as we do with Saul, just the controversial ones. David, where do we put David? Of course, great king, right? This one's going to be fairly quick. I don't think there's much debate on this one. Foreign policy, 10 out of 10. He captured Zobah again. So Saul had Zobah, but then, remember, there's a split because David and Ishbaal kind of split. There were 2 kings, and then David absorbed the northern tribes. So during that time, Zobah rebelled. But David recaptured it, kept the land up to the Euphrates, kept the land to the south, maintained Saul's borders, but then for sure, he's the one that culturally absorbed the Geshurites and Maccathites and Moabites, if Saul hadn't done that already. And we know this because David was the prince of Geshur. He married the king's daughter. So perfect foreign policy, and David really used peace as a primary method. He tried to negotiate things, culturally absorb people first. So this is why he was a loved king. Domestic policy, this is where David loses marks. He doesn't rank much higher than Saul, and he's not actually our top king. We'll show you the final ranking in the end. And the reason is domestic policy. This man was plagued by scandal. He had trouble uniting the kingdom from Saul's son, but then he dealt kindly with defectors and rebels, but to a fault. His own son rebelled against him, right? And how was his son able to get all of this support? Because David was missing at the city gates. If he's missing at the city gate, that means justice isn't being carried out. It's like the Supreme Court was not in session for half of David's reign. If the Supreme Court's out of order, then the people are suffering. He was, plagued with scandal with this. Even his top generals condemned him when he was crying about Absalom's death. And they go, look, we risked our lives. A lot of good people died because of that brat of yours. And you're crying about it? Pull yourself together or we're leaving too. Right? So they had to give him a shake sometimes. But He did the illegal census, which created the plague. He had the famine due to not dealing with the Gibeonite genocide. He executed his top general, Uriah. His son raped his daughter and then was murdered by Absalom, his other son, who then had to go into exile for a few years. His house was a disaster. So he loses a lot of marks on the domestic policy, mostly because of scandal and ineffectiveness. Spiritual policy, I mean, it's David. High marks. He was viewed as complete towards God. Despite the mistakes, he's not getting perfect marks. I mean, he committed murder. But he was respected by the prophets, by his contemporaries. He's the builder of the temple, not Solomon. We always go, oh, Solomon's temple? No, it's David's temple. David drew up the plans. David got the money together. David got all the network for the building supplies in place and everything on its way. David organized the priests. He organized the Levites, the temple singers. He got everyone set up for the temple. Solomon just smashed the champagne bottle against the hall. That's all he did. This was David's temple. Fantastic spiritual policy. Probably Solomon wouldn't have come up with the idea of a temple had David not. And that goes to his reputation. Perfect mark. David was a standard bearer for all the kings to succeed him. He got a covenant with God. He had perfect reputation. And that brings us to Solomon. So where do you put Solomon? I'm going to take a sip of tea. So Solomon, for me, is a failure. Why? You might be surprised. Why is he a failure? Well, foreign policy, terrible marks, right? This idea he had of monopolies, where together with Hiram of the Phoenicians and Sheba of the caravans, that they basically cut out, like he built fortified cities along the trade routes, shut out trade and taxed everything going through those trade routes and monopolizing it. This only made enemies, particularly of the Egyptians, who, as soon as Solomon was dead, rallied for war and came in and destroyed everything Solomon built. All the fortified cities were destroyed by Egypt. And this was aided in the fact that he exported weapons to future enemies. Right? The weapons that Solomon sold to these guys were later used on Israelites. Here's one for you that's a terrible foreign policy. He gave away the tribal land of Asher. What gives Solomon the right to give away God's inheritance to the Asherites? And how would you feel if you were in Asher and find out that your village was given to the Canaanites, given back to the Canaanites? Solomon was undoing the conquest and undoing the work of David and Saul. So Solomon's kingdom is a lot smaller, right? He lost the land of Zobah. Again, we always like this map of like, oh, look how big Solomon's kingdom was. No, Solomon's kingdom, he lost the land of Zobah, he lost the land of Moab, he lost Edom. All the wealth accumulated in his life, in Solomon's own words, was chasing after the wind and vanity, because not one of it lasted. And domestic policy is in the same boat. Terrible. Harsh conscription and forced labor for personal building projects. It's one thing if it's a temple and he stopped. But he had people, imagine if you're an Israelite, you're spending 1 out of every 3 months in Canaanite land, Phoenician land, working for them as a slave so that you can build palaces for Solomon's foreign wives, and probably even that building material went to false temples that he put up, right? Terrible, terrible. The division of the nation. Again, we'll say this next. It goes on Rehoboam's shoulders. We say, oh, Rehoboam, he split the kingdom. Nope. Solomon was the reason of the division of the kingdom. Jeroboam was anointed king during Solomon's life, and the only reason the split didn't happen then was because Solomon, in a murderous rage, drove Jeroboam out towards Egypt, running for his life. Otherwise, the split of the kingdom was going to happen during Solomon's life. It did happen spiritually under his life. So he had no excuse. Peaceful transfer of power. He had peace. He had uncontested rule. This was a man that just squandered and took advantage of the nation and the hardworking people. It's interesting to figure out the math on how much Solomon demanded from the people for his own household, for food, right? So each day, the people were to give him 20,000 liters of wheat, 30 cows, and 100 sheep. That's 36,000 sheep a year. That's, if he reigned for the 40 years, that's 1.4 million sheep. Like, do you know how much money that is back in those days for sheep? Like, it's crazy. It's crazy what he demanded of the people. It's why they left. Spiritual policy, again, everyone puts him high because he's a builder of the temple, but he's not the builder of the temple. David was the builder of the temple. David did the plans. David did the work. He just pulled the trigger on it. What was Solomon's legacy spiritually? He was the only king that God came and warned twice personally, saying, you better stop the path you're going down, or else, right? He had all the tools and no excuse. He personally led the nation into apostasy. He facilitated child sacrifice by building altars to Molech and Chemosh. He broke the laws about accumulating horses and weaponry and foreign wives and accumulating wives. You go through the list of the laws, Mosaic law, and look at how many Solomon broke. This was not a spiritual man. And that goes to his reputation. Yeah, some call him as a king of peace and a great king. And it's hard for ones because they connect Jesus to Solomon. But only aspects of Solomon's reign are connected to Jesus. In general, Solomon was viewed as being the apostate king. He had it all, and he went apostate. So he was a terrible king. Failure as a king. He ruined it for the nation. So now the kingdom splits, and we're going to go through the kings of Judah. So we start with Rehoboam, and Rehoboam, unfortunately, is an ineffective king. He was not effective at all, but, I mean, what choice did he have? Look at the mess his father gave him to work with. So, year 5 of his reign, Egypt comes in with Shishak and just cripples everything. Cripples the borders, cripples the defenses. Rehoboam is smart in suing for peace in order to save the nation's existence. But I mean, foreign policy, what was he supposed to do? He was a lame duck king. Domestic policy, the kingdom split under his rule because, I mean, he acted just like his dad of demanding harsh labor. But the reality is, it wouldn't have mattered. The kingdom was already split by God. And it was supposed to have happened a long time ago. But it didn't matter what Rehoboam did, they were leaving. This is the reality. They were leaving. Jeroboam was going to be king in Rehoboam's life. No matter what Rehoboam did, Jeroboam was going to be king. Now, all that said, domestic policy wasn't so bad. He fortified the defenses in an unambitious way. He kind of protected the heartland when you look at where he fortified. He resupplied food to all the cities, resupplied weaponry. He was willing to use the treasury to sue for peace. Good domestic policy, putting people first. Spiritual policy, half marks, a half-hearted attitude. He wasn't resolved in his heart to search for God. And when he was told the division was divine and not to go to war, he obeyed. He listened to the prophets. So he gets good marks for that. But generally, his reputation, he's not viewed well by history, by his contemporaries. He was blamed for the split of the kingdom, although the blame should have gone to his father. But it could be that information didn't come out until later, when the book was recorded. Then it became public knowledge. But otherwise, Rehoboam, not so good. And then we're going to skip now to Asa, jump to Asa. Asa was an effective king. He was a good king. Foreign policy, it wasn't the best. I mean, he, defended the borders against Ethiopia, but he really misused temple funds, and he bribed the Syrians to initiate war with Israel. So it's like he's told, don't go to war, don't fight these battles. No problem, I'll pay someone else to do it. He was condemned for this. So loses marks. That was a really stupid foreign policy decision, because again, that money came back in the form of weapons used against the Judeans later on. Domestic policy, it was good. It was solid. He followed the law, so people benefited. He maintained the borders, defended the borders, not a massive loss of life. Kind of nothing to specific to say about. So solid marks for his domestic policy. Spiritual policy was good. He conducted religious reform, including the royal house, which basically means he's trying to undo what Solomon did. That's what Asa is doing. However, terrible response to council. He imprisoned one of the prophets, but he removed the majority of the high place. He was viewed as his heart being complete towards God, so he gets good marks. And reputation was good as well. He was regarded as faithful. He was regarded as a great king. He received a state funeral. He was mourned. He was effective in his kingship. And now it brings us to Jehoshaphat, his son. Jehoshaphat, solid across the board. He was a great king. In fact, ranks higher than David. Why? Well, he didn't have the scandal. He worked together with the Kingdom of Israel in building military projects, although it almost got him killed at one point. He knew where to draw the line in some areas, like Amaziah's involvement with the ships. He's like, okay, but, my guys go on the ships, not your guys. This is a deal. Like, he knew where to draw a line, but it was really about friendly relationships with the neighbors. 2 Chronicles 17, 10, 11, the Philistines and the Arabs come under his domain. He's the first guy to subjugate the Philistines. He rules over Edomite land, 1 Kings 22:47. So this means he basically extended the borders bigger to what Saul, David, or Solomon had. He's got it filled out now. And the marriage alliance between his son and Athaliah was poorly thought out. This is where he loses marks. But, really, the working together with the king of Israel, with Ahab, he was counseled for this, saying, like, is it with the wicked you should work? And we're going to get into this with the spiritual side of it, but it seemed, though, like he understood the principle that although there was a split to the nation, they weren't supposed to be divided. It was supposed to just be a co-regency, which is smart. How could somebody ruling out of Jerusalem have their finger on the pulse of what's happening in Asher or Dan? So you needed two kings to have a balanced view of the interests of the whole nation. His spiritual policy, though, so domestic policy first, near perfect marks. Positive judicial reform is how he was defined. He wasted a bit of tax money on ambitious trade route projects, so with the shipbuilding. That's where he loses 1 mark. Now, if it worked, he would have had a perfect mark on domestic policy, but all the ships sank, so it was a waste of money. But in education programs, initiating proper standards for judges and princes, basically firing anyone that was perverting justice, this has a greater effect on the average person than anything else. Fantastic domestic policy. And spiritual policy, it affects that because the law he's carrying out is a spiritual law as well, right? 1 Kings 22 says that some of the high places were left, but we'll see this with Hezekiah's reign, what these high places are and why they weren't removed. But that focus on education in the law for commoners was smart. How can you expect people to follow God if they don't know how to follow God? Very smart tactic, very smart approach. He needed the prophetic correction, but when you look at the battle that he nearly got killed in, where he's working with Ahab, what city were they trying to take back? It's Ramoth Gilead. Ramoth Gilead was not just a Levitical city, but it was a city of refuge. So Ahab could have came to him and saying, look, you're a spiritual guy. We just lost a city of refuge. I need your help to save the poor people of that city. It's like his heart was in the right place. And so he scores fantastic on the spiritual policy because he understood how to get people following the law. He understood this very well. And maybe he saw hope for Ahab, but, he was counseled like, look, sorry, Ahab's wicked. Reputation, though, he was a great king. He was respected by prophets and contemporaries. Even God was like, when he got counsel, he's like, you shouldn't be doing this. But, there's so many good things with you. So he was a great king. Now, his kid, Jehoram, and this is welcome to our second failure of a king, Jehoram. The Philistines and the Arabs rebelled and just ran over the land, took all the territory. They killed the royal family. He was able to keep a little bit of peace with Israel, but it was a mess. It was a mess. When you're executing your own family, it's bad policy. And the domestic policy, I mean, you can't score him very high with that. The whole nation suffered. He was a dictator. He was a first real true dictator of the Judeans. Spiritual policy, I mean, Elijah came out of retirement to condemn him. So when you can get one of the top prophets to go, well, I guess I got to go south and give a message. Like, I mean, you know you're doing something bad. But, you know, he led Judah and Jerusalem back to all the high places, spiritual prostitution. He dissolved the Mosaic law, essentially. Terrible king. And the fact is in his reputation, which he gets 0 marks for, because 2 Chronicles 21:20 says, no one regretted that he died. So again, that word regret. It's not no one's like, oh, it's my fault he died. No. It's no one was like, oh, that's a shame. What a pity he died. Nobody. No one felt pity. So, yeah, Jehoram. And that leads to Athaliah, which is a bottom mark. She gets 0s across the board. Athaliah. We don't know anything about her foreign policy, but we don't need to know anything. She attempted to eradicate the royal house of Judah. She attempted to eradicate Judean culture and history, and likely also language. She robbed the temple treasury for her own personal use and for Baal worship. She attempted to eradicate the law. The high priest had to lead the insurrection against her and was joined by the military, and the high priest joined. And I mean, her famous last words are conspiracy, conspiracy, right? Yes, the whole nation hates you with such a passion. They all work together to conspire to destroy you. You know, she was executed by her subjects. So obviously, at 2 Kings 11:20, everyone rejoiced when she died. So, yeah, bottom marks for Athaliah. Sorry. So, Jehoash is next. Let's take a cup of tea. So Jehoash, I'm putting him as not effective. Not effective at all. Why? Well, Hazael of Syria invaded. He had to be paid tribute with all the gold of the temple and the treasury. He was assassinated by Moabite and Ammonites. So, you know, when foreign leaders are conspiring your death and pull it off, you know, you're not good at foreign policy. So, domestic policy, you know, again, just completely ineffective. He called out the corruption and the lack of work effort from the Levites in repairing the temple, but then he didn't hold anyone really accountable. He just also gave up himself. And this is why spiritual policy, he gets half marks, because yes, he cleansed the land of the Baal temple and the priests. He reorganized the temple and the priesthood and the Levites. He stationed guards at the temple entrance to protect it spiritually. But he didn't completely cleanse the land. It could be because Jerusalem and the heartland was the focus, and then to extend outward. But 2 Kings 12:17 says the Levites were to blame for that lackluster effort. They held him back, and it's interesting to wonder what would have happened had they really rallied around him to bring back pure worship. By the end, he just kind of gives up as well. And maybe that's what turned him off of it, that he did all this work and to be repaid with lackluster. He ends up killing Zechariah the prophet, which, not the writer of the book, but different one. So, in general, his reputation is right in the middle, that he did good with respect to God in the temple. So it's it's that idea of there's some good things in you. He did good with that, but he just wasn't effective enough to get everyone pulling together. Which he should have, because he was a king as a result of a coup, but it could have been his young age that people just didn't respect him. So it's interesting to wonder what could have happened. Amaziah is an interesting one as well. We put him also as not effective. He crushed the Edomites from Seir at the Dead Sea in a great battle. Great victory, but then how should we say, he pooped the bed. he took on the Israelites, which he knew was a vastly superior army, and he knew this because in the battle against the Edomites he initially hired the Israelite army to help him, because he viewed it as the only way to win. And God's prophet said, don't work with them, they're not righteous people, send them back. So when they left, they ransacked a few of the villages of Judah. And so when the battle's over, he goes, "Hey, I hear you ransacked my villages. Well, you want to go? Let's go. Let's go." It's like, maybe it was just a bluff, but boy, they didn't take that lightly. There was a hostage situation with the royal family in Samaria. The temple was ransacked. Jerusalem's walls were breached. Like they almost took Jerusalem from them. This was just stupid foreign policy. Domestic policy, obviously, if your foreign policy is that bad, your domestic isn't going to be that good either. He executed the assassins of his father Jehoash. He attempted to avenge the Judean towns, like for the honor, but boy, it would have been a lot smarter to just take the spoils of war and say, "I'm sorry what the Israelites did. That's my fault. I'm going to give you spoils of war to apologize." That would have been much better. Hindsight's 2020, though, right? Spiritual policy, yeah, half marks, basically. Yeah. He followed the law with regard to not holding sons accountable to the sins of the father. He listened to God's prophet when it came to not using Israel for the war. But then when he won the war against Edom, he started worshiping Edomite gods. It's like facepalm. Like, what's wrong with you? And this is, the ineffectiveness is in his reputation. He's assassinated, but then they bury him in Jerusalem. So they assassinate him and then bring the body back in state funeral. And so, they're like, "We like you, but not as a king." So he's out. Uzziah is next, and Uzziah, great king. We'll put him as a great king. Why? Foreign policy, good, near perfect marks. He recaptured this lost land. He recaptured Elath and the Red Sea port back to Israel. He pushed against the Philistines. He captured Gath. He captured Yavne. Ammon subjected themselves to him. The Egyptians had positive diplomatic relations with him. He worked together with Jeroboam II. An interesting thing is he may have given his sister or cousin in marriage to Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria. And so forming a marriage alliance and a connection between Judah and the Assyrians, which is very interesting. Which could have all been part of Jonah's urging of political reform, which we have an episode about this. Check out an episode, very interesting, about Sennacherib and the half-Jewish Sennacherib. So check out that episode on Taste and See TV. Domestic policy, again, great. His rule saw the great earthquake. It's mentioned in Amos 1:1, Zechariah 14:5. So that means massive reconstruction projects. City walls had to be rebuilt. So Jerusalem was rebuilt. The towers were rebuilt. Towers in the desert were rebuilt, so fortifying the boundaries of the land. He built cisterns, so making sure people had water, vineyards. It was like an agricultural revolution, and fantastic domestic policy. Spiritual policy, he searched for God. He did what was right in God's eyes. Really good. He didn't remove the Asherahs. And again, we'll get into this with Hezekiah, what we're talking when we keep saying that they didn't remove all the Asherahs, sacred bulls and high places. But at the end of his life, he started to become very haughty. He was a great king, but he knew he was a great king, and it went to his head. And he started to act as a priest to burn incense towards God and was struck with leprosy. But again, like, he's trying to worship God. He's just presumptuous. He was like Saul. He loses marks for the presumptuousness, but like, his motivation was like, I love God so much, I should be a priest. So he loses marks. But reputation, positive reputation with contemporaries, with world rulers, with prophets. Despite making the mistake at the end, I mean, he's remembered very, very well. So, yeah. And that's and may have gotten 2 state funerals, technically, because they found his grave, which may have been a reburial. So at some point they may have reburied Uzziah's bones and given him a second state funeral later on in history. But otherwise, great king with Uzziah. So Saul wasn't the only one to get 2 state funerals, possibly also Uzziah. Jotham is next. Jotham, effective king. We don't have too many in this category where they just they weren't great, but they weren't average. Jotham, he put down the Ammonite uprising. He received substantial tribute from them. He dealt with constant fighting, though, between Rezin of Syria and Pekah of Israel. Like, he just couldn't seal off that northern border. So foreign policy loses a bit there because he couldn't find a way around and to make peace with Syria at least. Domestic policy, good. He continued the domestic building projects to protect the people. He maintained control of the borders. But a lot of this was likely in preparation for Assyrian imperialism. Everyone saw this coming on the horizon. It had been on hiatus for a bit, but Assyria was rising up again and sweeping southward. A lot of this was Jotham probably preparing for war. Spiritual policy was solid, good marks. He walked with God. He did what was right in God's eyes. He didn't remove the Asherahs in high places. We'll get into this later. Generally, the people were unfaithful. So it seems like he didn't enforce the Mosaic Law. So he was good. He walked with God, but he didn't force others to do that, whether you consider that good or bad. But the Mosaic Law, as much as it was a spiritual law, was also just the law. So, he didn't enforce the law, which was not good spiritually and takes points off for the domestic policy. But reputation, he was viewed well. You see the abundance of the prophets in his lifetime, and they aren't condemning him personally. So it seems like he must have been doing something well because he's not receiving a lot of personal counsel that we know of. So he was effective. Ahaz, failure. Fail. Not as bad as the other ones, but fail. He loses a pivotal battle to Syria and Israel. So again, Syria and Israel, Rezin and Pekah keep coming in, right? This causes a series of rebellions because it's like the blood in the water with the sharks, right? They're all swirling around Judah, and they sense the blood in the water. The Edomites seize control of the south. They retake Elath. He loses a Shephelah to the Philistines, all the way to Bet Shemesh, Soko, Timnah. Huge loss of land, right up to the hills, Judean hills and mountains. This was the heartland, really, that they were right up to. He allied with Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser, which, again, spiritually, we view this bad. We're like, oh, he's so short-sighted. He had no faith that he relied on Assyria and made an alliance. Well, what's the guy supposed to do? The Edomites are destroying him in the south. The Philistines are destroying him in the west. The Israelites and Syrians are destroying him in the north. What other choice does he have? He's got to make some sort of political alliance to save his nation. So was it short-sighted? Because, the Assyrians ended up coming right back and smacking them. Well, yeah, maybe short-sighted, but he had no options. This is why he was it wasn't just ineffective, it was also a failure. Domestic policy, the Assyrian alliance was just stopping the bleeding, but it didn't last long. As domestic policy just failed. You had people dying left, right, and center from these attacks. Spiritual policy, he's right up there with Solomon on the spiritual policy. He made his kids pass through the fire. He sacrificed at the high places and Asherahs. He promoted apostasy. He shut down the temple. However, he did raise Hezekiah, so he gets a couple points. And because he sacrificed his kids, Hezekiah became king, which it's an interesting, how the turntables turn, that had he not sacrificed his other kids, we don't get Hezekiah. So you gotta give him a couple points, right? But generally he's regarded as a terrible king, so he was a failure. And this brings us to Hezekiah. And so Hezekiah, where do you put him? I'm gonna pause this. Hey, cup of tea. Where are you gonna put Hezekiah? Which, by the way, you can get some great Bible swag on our shop, drinkoffering.com. And Hezekiah was an average king. Sorry, putting him as average. Do you have him higher? You probably have him higher. Why do we have him so low? Foreign policy and domestic policy. Foreign policy, he's got one of the lowest foreign policy ratings that I've given to any of these kings. Why? So, okay, we're going to actually start with his reputation, which he gets 9 out of 10 for. There was nobody like him among all the kings of Judah after him or those prior to him. Okay? So his spiritual qualities eclipsed any of his failings. And, just everyone forgot about how bad he was with foreign policy. because of how spiritual he was. And part of it is also that, history is written by not just the victors, but the survivors. The people that would have disagreed with that statement that he was the best of all the kings were people that lived in Lachish, Libnah, Beersheba that were destroyed and killed by the Assyrians. So they didn't get a say. But when it says like he was the greatest of all the kings, we're talking in a personal spiritual relationship. We're not talking just effectiveness, okay? And that goes to the spiritual policy as well, which we'll go into that next. Finally, someone that removes the high places. We have archaeological examples of this. At Lachish, we have the high place that is desecrated with a toilet and sealed off. At Beersheba, we have the altar that was smashed and separated. But he also smashed the copper serpent built by Moses. So you think of this. That was not destroyed by David, by Solomon, by Asa, Jehoshaphat. No one destroyed the copper serpent of Moses because it was sentimental. This was their history. This was something they could point to, like a museum piece, right? But people were worshiping this, and Hezekiah is like, look, we got to get rid of this. It's our history. Yes, it's our culture. I don't care. Smash it. So massive religious reform. Brought back all the festivals, invited everyone from the 10 tribes to get down. Interesting enough that had people taken the chance, had they listened and gone to celebrate the festivals, they wouldn't have died from the Assyrian invasion. Because we see this historically, that Jerusalem suddenly booms in size at the beginning of Hezekiah's reign, because everyone that moved south said, I'm staying. So he did a lot of really good things, reorganized and re-enrolled the priests and the Levites, organized them. Great stuff. Foreign policy. Let's talk about what it was like actually living under his reign. He defeats the Philistines, clear to Gaza, liberating the land lost during his father's reign, right? So, hurrah. He imprisons Paddy of Ekron. Hurrah. One problem, Hezekiah. That's vassal territory of the Assyrians. Paddy is the vassal king. That's an act of war. You've attacked Assyria. By attacking the vassal, you've attacked Assyria. Add to it that the Philistines' responsibility during the Assyrian imperialism was they provided weapons to Assyria, as well as tribute. So you're now cutting off the supply of taxes, the access to Egypt, and the weapons to Assyria. What did you think was going to happen, Hezekiah? He also receives a delegation from Babylon. Babylon is the sworn enemy of Assyria. Babylon is who killed Sennacherib's father, Sargon II, in battle. We can throw in Isaiah 30, which seems to be a condemnation of relying on Egypt for support against Assyria. So it's like, we like to paint it that Hezekiah wouldn't have relied on Egypt. He wouldn't have relied on Egypt. He only relied on God. Okay, yes, but Hezekiah was condemning somebody for relying on Egypt. And when the Rabshakeh came in, they seemed to feel like Hezekiah was at least talking to Egypt about their plans and going like, hey, what are you guys up to? What do you want to do? Because if we do this, are you going to do that? So he wasn't maybe relying on them, but Assyria took it that there was a collusion happening. To the point where 2 Kings 18 and 14, what does Hezekiah say? I'm to blame. I'm at fault. I apologize. Apologize to Sennacherib. And so what did throwing off the Assyrian yoke get him, right? We applaud him. We slow clap him for throwing off the yoke of Assyria. But what happened? The yoke went right back on. It was heavier and massive loss of life, which goes to the terrible domestic policy. I mean, everyone points to the tunnel, the Siloam Tunnel in Jerusalem. Yeah, it's a great program, but they didn't need it because Assyria never got to Jerusalem. Yeah, he expanded the walls of Jerusalem, but they were unused. They didn't need to be used. He supported the refugee influx from the 10 tribes, but typically, people were dying left, right, and center during his reign from the Assyrians, dying a brutal death, to where people were basically disobeying Hezekiah's orders. That, he's throwing off the yoke of Assyria, and when Assyria's coming in, they're opening the doors. because Assyria had an open door policy. If you open the doors to the army, then they pass by. You aren't brutalized. You basically subject yourselves to them. So all the cities were doing this, saying, forget Hezekiah. Assyria, we're not connected to them. Don't kill us. So the Rabshakeh told him, like, the message from Sennacherib was, look, you want to go mano a mano, no problem. You pitch an army, we'll pitch an army. We'll give you 2,000 horses if you can have enough riders for them. And it was, tongue in cheek, but the reality was Hezekiah didn't have a military anymore. It was gone. He didn't have 2,000 people to fight. So that's a collapse. Economic collapse, military collapse, population collapse. He lost access to the trade routes after this. He lost Lachish, which was his main city. Jerusalem wasn't a big city. Lachish, the palace of Lachish is bigger than the city of David. Bigger than Samaria. Like Lachish was your New York City. Terrible. It just got brutalized. Hezekiah was, I'm sorry, he made some dumb mistakes. So he was average. If not for his spiritual policy, he's a failure. Sorry. Speaking of failure, Manasseh. Foreign policy. We don't know much about his foreign policy, but Esarhaddon of Assyria imprisoned him. So that tells us there was a breakdown in foreign policy. Domestic policy, he shed innocent blood and perhaps was the one who had Isaiah killed, the beloved prophet Isaiah. So not doing good there. Spiritual policy, he reinstituted Baal worship, the Asherahs, child sacrifice, magic. He defiled the house of God. He led the nation astray. He was like Solomon on crack. So, yes, he repented. Yes, he came back and he tried to undo it. But by that point, it was like too little, too late, man. And this goes to his reputation. Manasseh is the reason God swore to destroy Judah. So it doesn't matter how hard you try and redeem yourself. You are a failure of a king when God says, I'm destroying the nation because of you. And it comes up later in history that God reminds him, because of Manasseh, I'm destroying you. So yes, he was forgiven by God, but at what cost? And this brings us to Josiah. Josiah, great king. Foreign policy, he loses some marks, right? He was good up until the end. This campaign with the war against Necho. It's a poor calculation. Let me explain it to you. I'll tell you what I think Josiah was thinking, what he was doing. Is, where was Necho going? Necho was going to Nineveh, I think it is, to help Ashurbanipal the third. Or second, Ashurbanipal II, in his war against Nebuchadnezzar. This was like the last stand of Assyria before Babylon destroys them. So Necho, allied with Assyria, he came in to help. And so, Josiah knew the Chaldeans were going to come and destroy them. He knew the Chaldeans were the hand of God and Babylon. And so he probably calculated that, look, if I can shut down Necho, then when Assyria falls and Babylon turns south, I can say, you're welcome, your highness. We helped stop. We are allies, and we subject ourselves to you. And he could save the nation that way. This is probably the thinking, but sorry, buddy, it ain't your call to make. It ended up setting up Egyptian oppression in the future because Necho did not forget that. It delayed him enough and caused enough of a blow that they weren't able to get to help Ashurbanipal in time, and Assyria collapsed and Egypt held Judah accountable. Domestic policy, though, good, positive. We don't know the specifics, but there seemed to be a lot of rebuilding, a lot of preparation for war. Archaeologically, we know Lachish has been rebuilt to this point, Beersheba's rebuilt, a lot of the other major cities destroyed by Sennacherib are rebuilt. So he had done a good job getting the nation back on its feet. Spiritual policy was great. He reinstituted the Passover. It was the largest since Solomon's time. So a very spiritual man. His spiritual reform extended to the 10-tribe kingdom, going back to kind of find anyone left and bringing them back to God. He finally destroys the high place of Bethel. He repairs the temple. He teaches the law. He conducts a second reform as well, smashing idols. We have archaeological evidence of this at Bet Shemesh as well. But he broke the law with having multiple wives. But destroying the high place at Bethel, we're going to come back to this. So stay tuned. Don't drop out, because we're coming back to the Bethel aspect. Because the Ark of the Covenant is not mentioned for a long time, and then it's mentioned again with Josiah, saying, put it back in the temple. Where was it? Where was it before? Okay, so Bethel, Ark of the Covenant, put it back in. Okay, we're going to come back to this. Buckle up. And we'll do a taste and see about this, behind the research on it, of the travels of the Ark. But let's keep going. 2 kings left. Jehoiakim is left. A failure. Zeros across the board. He's like Athaliah. Foreign policy was a failure. Again, this is a blood in the water thing. The Chaldeans, the Syrians, the Moabites, the Ammonites, their marauder bands start picking off cities, plundering the people. He became a vassal to Necho, who imposed a massive tax and tribute on them. This would have been the good time to turn to Babylon and say, Babylon, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, help us. We're going to fight Necho, but we need your help. He didn't. He was really short-sighted on his foreign policy and domestic policy. Jeremiah 22:17, his rule was marked by fraud, extortion, dishonest gain, shedding of innocent blood, high taxes. Spiritual policy was bad all around the nation. Spiritual implosion from the time of Josiah. 2 Kings 24, it mentions again the sins of Manasseh, and showing how enduring Manasseh's bad policy was, and that Jehoiakim just brought it back. So, no one was sad about his death, so failure of a king. And Zedekiah, failure as well. And really a failure because he didn't have to be a failure. He was set up as a puppet king, and his name was changed to Zedekiah. It's very interesting. Nebuchadnezzar changed his name to Zedekiah, which means Jehovah is just. So in Babylon's eyes, this was justice. You guys have been really stupid with foreign policy. You haven't been working with us. And so I'm putting on a puppet, and your God is just for allowing this. And that's it. And he leaves. All the prophets told Zedekiah, just stick to Babylon. Stick to the oath. Don't rebel. Respect it, and everything is fine. There would have still been a temple, still been Jerusalem. Nothing would have been destroyed had he stayed under Babylon. Domestic policy, though, which obviously he messed that up, right? Which is why he's a failure. The place was destroyed. Domestic policy, the military, the nobles, craftsmen, educated, they were all removed from Judah. Basically, brain drain policy. This was under Jehoiachin's rule, so that means Zedekiah's rule. He just had nothing. A lame duck from the start. So his job was easy. Just maintain food stocks, encourage obedience. But he just wasn't good even at the domestic side of it. He listened to a lot of bad advice, which drowned out the good advice from Jeremiah and Baruch and Zephaniah, other prophets at the time. He just didn't see the errors of the past. He's the guy collapsed under, so he is a failure. So that's the kings of Judah. That's the kings of Judah. So now we're going to rewind, start back at the kings of Israel with Jeroboam the first. Quick cup of coffee break, and be right back. All right, are you still with us? Kings of Israel, Jeroboam the first. Where do we place him? Ineffective. Maybe you thought he was a failure. He's not a failure. Again, let's one thing at a time. Foreign policy. It was stupid to lead a war against Judah. He knew that he was the king of the 10 tribes, not the other two. Why are you going to war with them? Why are you going on the offense? Stick to defense. There was no need to do this. And the attempt to capture the other two tribes, or at least to fight against them, was really stupid. He was obliterated by Shishak, which is odd because he lived with Shishak. He lived in Egypt under Shishak for a while. So there seemed to be a major failure in the foreign policy that Shishak then right away comes and strikes back at someone he knew very well. So his foreign policy is where he loses a lot of marks. Otherwise, he probably would have actually been an average king. Domestic policy. So, spiritual aspect. Let's put that aside for a moment. We'll talk about spiritual policy. Domestic policy itself was good. Why? So, although it was kind of against the law, he adjusted the festivals, or he adjusted the calendar. He moved the festivals 1 month later. That was likely at the urging of the people going, look, these festivals are landing right at the busy time of the agricultural season. And so he kept the festivals just a month later so that it would be easier for everyone to celebrate the festivals. And his focus was really about honoring the past, honoring Israel, honoring the 10 tribes. This was a nationalist. And the people loved it. They really liked that. So, for example, his 2 capitals. What were his 2 capital cities? Shechem. Shechem has such a deep connection to the patriarchs. I mean, Joseph was buried there. And Penuel. Penuel is where Jacob became Israel, where he fought with the angel. Right? So those are his capital cities. And also one on this side of the river, one on that side of the river, so that the tribes and the people living on the other side of the river felt part of it. They felt part of the nation. They weren't excluded. Really good domestic policy. The high places at Bethel and Dan, again, it's like, oh, apostasy. Yes, but Bethel had been a high place since Abraham started it being a high place. Likely the altar of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Phineas also had a high place there. These altars were likely still in place and had been in use the entire time. This is where the tabernacle was, with the Ark of the Covenant for a time. So the name means house of God. So he honored the past by making it an official high place. Dan, again, this was a high place since the time of Joshua. Joshua didn't remove it. None of the judges removed it. And Saul didn't remove it. David didn't remove it. Solomon didn't remove it. Dan had a high place, and the lineage of Moses through Jonathan, his grandson, were the priesthood there. This was a deep cultural history that he just kind of made official, and that's his failing. The spiritual policy isn't good because he put the stamp and seal of approval on apostasy. That was his sin. That was what he really did dumb. That's why all the sin is on his shoulders, because he made it official policy that this is our state religion. We do not go to Jerusalem. That is our state religion. He was a people pleaser, right? He was populist. He was a populist king. Again, you can't put the entire apostasy on him, though, because that apostasy at Dan began at Joshua's life, and Joshua didn't stop it, and nor did any of the high priests back then, like Eleazar or Phineas. Apostasy in the northern tribes, Megiddo, Dor, Akko. Solomon had wives living in these cities that were promoting apostasy. This apostasy began under Solomon's reign. It was making it national policy was the problem. He wasn't as bad spiritually as Solomon because, I'm sorry, but maybe I missed it, but Jeroboam didn't sacrifice babies. So he didn't do Molech. So he's a little bit better than Solomon. He was apostate, but he didn't kill babies. His reputation, it also kills him. He has the sins of the whole nation. His lineage didn't last long. I don't think it's quite fair to put everything on him because each person is their own, but it's the policy that endured, Jeroboam's policy. So ineffective, because with what he had, he could have been a great king, and he squandered it, blew his chance. Baasha, failure. He's zeros across the board. There's constant war between Asa and Baasha. This caused Asa to bring in the Syrians. He lost large amounts of land as a result of this in the northeast. He retreated to his capital of Tirzah, which he had moved the capital now, and this allowed Asa to dismantle towers of Ramah, fortify Benjaminite land, and kind of solidify the border. Asa is the first one to kind of recognize there's a military split now, and he puts the fortifications on the border between Israel and Judah. He domestic policy assassinated Nadab. He killed Jeroboam's lineage to the throne. Civil unrest, warfare, insecurity. This is what marks his life. So it's typically a bad time to live in Israel if that's marking your reign. And spiritual policy, he continued the sins of Jeroboam. Jehu ben Hanani, the prophet, warned him that his house was going to be wiped out. But he still didn't repent. He didn't change. He didn't care. So, bad reputation. He was remembered as wicked. He was ineffective. Even in just defending the land and foreign policy, he was just a failure. Omri was effective. He was an effective king. He was a general in the army, is how he started, fighting against the Philistines. The Moabite stone actually states that Omri was the one who subjected the Moabites. Means he was, as king, fighting on the other side of the river, securing the tribal land there. He was a shrewd politician. He opened up trade to the Syrians in order to get some peace going. He allowed them to set up markets in his new capital. He paid tribute to Assyria. Again, people see this as short-sighted and lack of faith, but this was a smart politician. Assyria was becoming a threat, and he wanted to let them know, look, we don't have a quorum with you, you don't have a quorum with us. He started a bit of an alliance with the Phoenicians, it seems. We don't read of any attacks against Judah. This could be where the alliance between Josaphat and Ahab is born. But the Bible says that he had many mighty exploits. So Omri must have been effective. Domestic policy was good. He was a fighter, right? He was a general, frontline guy. He refused to let an assassin take the throne. He took action immediately. Even though there's a power struggle, he came out on top. He established Samaria as the capital, which was a very good strategic move. Samaria was a lot more strategic capital. Spiritually, the Bible says he was worse than Jeroboam spiritually, but again, not as bad as Solomon or Manasseh. He didn't sacrifice babies, that we know of. Usually it's listed if they did that. Not good, but not the worst. And his reputation, the Omri dynasty, is the most enduring of the Israelite kingdom in archaeology and in history. His governmental policies and statutes continued for 200 years, according to Micah 6 and 16. So, although he wasn't spiritually good, he was very effective as a leader, and that's why he's there. So he's not effective spiritually, but just as a king, when your policies can last 200 years, I mean, that's a good king. So Ahab, average. Ahab, he was close to being effective, but average. Great military victories. He was a great commander, just like his father, kind of like an equal to his father, which is where the name Ahab may come from. Achav, brother, which literally means brother, father, or father's brother. But it's not uncle, because if you're thinking your father's brother, you're thinking uncle. There's a different word for uncle. So it's almost like the brother kind of means like equal. We're brothers. So if he's brothers to his father, then it's like he was equal to his dad. Could be what the name means. But he was a fighter. He stopped Assyrian imperialism in its track at the Battle of Kakar. Had a great chariot army. Peace through power. He made alliances with the Phoenicians, with other nations, with the Egyptians, with everybody. He was a good leader all around when it came to foreign policy. Really, really good. Domestic policy, people prospered up until the famine. If not for the famine, they would have been doing a lot better, but they bounced back quickly. I mean, after the famine, they've got Naboth has his vineyard going well and vegetable garden. And, it's really his wife that was a tyrant. He just didn't really care to stop his wife. He was a politician first and foremost. So, it's interesting. He turned to Josaphat when he needed Josaphat, but he didn't kill the worshipers of God, which we'll get into, but he also didn't promote the worshipers of God. He was just very apathetic on the spiritual policy, which is where he loses his marks. The apathy is what kills him. I mean, he's a very bad on the spiritual policy. It stated that he was worse than all those prior. He actively opposed God's prophet, although he allowed them to exist. He didn't kill Elijah. He didn't kill Obadiah, his household servant. His household servant worshipped God, and was able to care for 100 prophets in a cave with food and water from the royal house. How do you do this without Ahab's knowledge? So Ahab must have known to an extent, but he's just apathetic. He's like, you know what? I'll keep it on both sides. Keep support all around, right? He allowed the fire test to take place. if this is a guy that hated God, why even allow Elijah to do that? He worked with Jehoshaphat, who Jehoshaphat, as we mentioned, was enacting major education and spiritual reforms. And he was like his buddy. They're like best friends. So he wasn't a spiritual person. But, so it's just like it was, if not for Jezebel, things would have been better. That said, Elijah was told that there are still 7,000 that were doing pure worship. We might think it's a small number, but by Menahem's life, you can do the math on the taxes of about how many men lived in the country, and about 60,000 men. So let's say there's a bit more in Ahab's life, 70,000 men. That 10% of the country were still doing pure worship. That's pretty good for the 10-tribe kingdom. That's pretty good. But average, historically, we have a lot from Ahab. He's remembered secularly as a great king. So he scores high for that. Just spiritually, he wasn't good. So he was average as a king. Jehoram, his son, ineffective. He was able to keep Moab in subjection, though it was only thanks to Jehoshaphat, is what we were told. Syria came into war against him. They sieged the capital, Samaria. He did win a great victory, but there was just constant fighting in Syria through his whole reign. Domestic policy was horrendous. There was a great famine due to the war, and that's the account in 2 Kings 6:28-29 with the women eating their children. Remember? They go, hey, we need a judicial decision. He's like, yeah, what is it? Well, she said, we're starving, so today we'll eat your kid, and tomorrow we'll eat my kid. So we ate my kid yesterday, but now she won't let me eat her kid. So can you punish her? And he's like, he was ready to throw up. He was sickened, and he blames Elijah for this. Or Elisha, sorry. And the reason is because, remember, just prior to this with the foreign policy, Elisha had led the army to Samaria in blindness, right? And he was going to strike them down. And Elisha's like, no, treat them kindly and send them off. He might have thought, had I just killed them, we wouldn't be in this situation. And that's with the spiritual policy. Half marks. He attempted religious reform to a small extent. He removed some of the Asherahs of his father. It was too little, too late. He wasn't really aware of Elisha for part of his life. A servant had to tell him about him. But then he listened to Elisha later. Like when Naaman arrived, he listened to Elisha's advice. When this blinded Syrians showed up, he listened to Elisha. He called Elisha Avi, my father. So, there was something good with him. It just wasn't enough. So that's why he's ineffective. Elisha kept helping him. And it shows there was something good there and there's potential there, but just not enough to make it last. And he was wounded in battle. Jehu took over. Jehu was already anointed as king. So, this is where Jehoram was ineffective. He was a lame duck. He was going to be assassinated. And maybe Elisha knew this, but yeah, just nothing he could do. And that brings us to Jehu, who was an average king. He began losing territory to Syria again during his kingship. A constant war again. Most of the territory east of the Jordan was lost to Hazael. He was smart. He paid tribute to Assyria, kept them at bay. He knew if he couldn't beat the Syrians, he couldn't beat the Assyrians. So half marks for foreign policy. Domestic policy, he ensured a quick transfer of power. He quickly killed off the Omrid dynasty with the help of the people. He united the army against Baal worship. And that's through his spiritual policy. Really smart spiritual reform. If you remember the tactic he used, he told the priests of Baal, if you think Ahab was 100% for you guys, well, I'm 120%. So why don't we get everybody together and I'll show you. We're going to do the biggest festival of Baal you've ever seen. And so they rounded everybody up and they go, okay, we're here. Let's start. He goes, great, kill them all. So really genius way to just snuff out Baal worship. He turned the temples into latrines. We see this done by Hezekiah archaeologically as well later on. But he kept Bethel, he kept Dan. Again, this could be sentimental reasons and cultural reasons for it. But so he did good, but it just wasn't quite enough. And reputation, he was remembered for zeal. Zealous king, but he was also a shedder of blood, bloodthirsty guy. A lot of people died under his reign. He couldn't secure his border. He couldn't secure his legacy. So he was average. Jehoaz, lame duck, ineffective. He loses Dan to Hazael. That's where the Tel Dan Stele comes in. Much of his territory was lost. Most of the population was displaced due to the Syrian war. That means likely famine, economic collapse. There's no building work or infrastructure work. So domestic policy is terrible. Spiritual policy, he allowed apostasy to continue in the land. He had an Asherah in Samaria. He did turn to God when things got really bad, but it just, not a great reputation and nothing really remarkable about his reign. So he wasn't a complete failure, but he just wasn't effective. Jehoash, though, was effective. With the wars with Syria, he was able to take back the land that was lost, including Dan, which is where the Dan Stele was turned around and used in secondary use, thanks to Elijah. But in this case, he was lacking zeal. He just didn't have the oomph. Moabite marauders were coming into the land, and he had that problem he was dealing with. Amaziah of Judah was provoking him into war. And so this is the interesting one that we come back to. So he gains a large portion of control of Judah. Places like Beth Shemesh come under his control. He breaches the walls of Jerusalem, and he cleans out the temple. 2 Kings 14:14. So where is the Ark of the Covenant? Samaria, right? He takes every article of the temple. So that would include the Ark of the Covenant. Went back to Samaria. So where did it go from Samaria? Dan. It probably went to, not Dan, Bethel. It went to Bethel. Why? Because then we don't hear about the Ark of the Covenant again until Josiah destroys the altar at Bethel and says, and now we got to put that Ark of the Covenant in the temple. Don't hold it on your shoulders, put it in the temple. So it may have been at Bethel from the time of Jehoash down to Josiah. Cool, hey? We don't know, but it's an interesting thought. Domestic policy. It would have been good, right? There's a lot of land captured, a lot of spoils of war. Economic times were good, so that means life was typically good for people living there. Good marks for that. Spiritual policy, half and half. He wasn't near wholehearted in worship. And to pillage the temple, it's pretty bad. It's quite the offense, but maybe it was like, you guys don't deserve the Ark of the Covenant. We have Elisha. We get the Ark of the Covenant. And putting it back at Bethel. Remember, during the time of the Judges, there was a time where the Ark of the Covenant was at Bethel. So maybe he felt that Jerusalem was a pagan temple. It shouldn't have been there. It should have been at Bethel from the whole time. But he was effective as a king. The people prospered. People did well. He won a lot of battles. He was good in his rule. Jeroboam II. You ready for this? Jeroboam II. Great king. This is the only great king of Israel, was Jeroboam II. I mean, foreign policy, perfect marks. You can't do better than Jeroboam II. He had a kingdom as large as, if not larger, than David and Saul and Solomon. Jonah prophesied his conquest of Syria, of Damascus and Hamath. And then Jonah goes to Nineveh to say destruction is coming. So likely they were anticipating Jeroboam, who was just marching and destroying everything. Had Nineveh not repented, Jeroboam II may have been the one to conquer Nineveh, which is mind-blowing when you think of it, that they could have extended that far. He conquered the south as well, which means that he was likely working in tandem and maybe even sitting on the throne of Judah for a time, because Uzziah was very, very young. They could have been co-regency over Judah for a time, because he's the one that helps to secure the Red Sea and Elath. He secures the battles at Gath against the Philistines, the Ammonites. He has peace with Egypt. So Jeroboam may have been the mentor of Uzziah, who is also a great king. Again, in his reign was the great earthquake of Amos 1:1, Zechariah 14:15. Quickly, he rebuilt all the cities. We see this archaeologically, but he also rebuilt the high places. But he built grain silos. He may have had a really harsh tax policy, though, so he loses some marks for that. Amos 5:11 alludes to that. But people were wealthy. This was the condemnation from the prophets, was the wealth, the gold, the ivory, the purple, all the luxury items. They had grown fat and complacent. So, I mean, that's pretty good living for domestic policy. He had a strong economy, and so you can't fault him on the domestic policy. Although we do fault him in 2 points, because murder and prostitution, according to Hosea, had become commonplace, and he may be referring to Jeroboam's reign. We don't know for sure, but at least he would have set it up. So he loses the mark for that. Spiritual policy, 2 Kings 14:27, God uses Jeroboam to save Israel. So if you're being used by God to save the nation, you can't be doing that much wrong. He didn't clear out false worship. He probably promoted it by rebuilding. We know the expansion to Dan, the holy place of Dan at this time. But he worked with the prophets. He worked with Jonah. He worked with Amos. He seemed to be blessed by God. So he wasn't a great king spiritually, but he was solid, at least, to where he was blessed. And his reputation, 9 out of 10. We don't, it's strange, we only have one paragraph about him in the Bible and one paragraph about him in Josephus, and it's the same paragraph. So it's almost like there was a book written about him that got lost and destroyed, and everything about him and all they could remember was just the basic points of the one paragraph. But otherwise, yeah, there's a lot of prophets that condemned the people and counseled the people during his life, but him personally receiving counsel, like some of the other ones did, like Ahab got personal counsel and Jeroboam got personal counsel. We don't really see that with Jeroboam II. This is the high point of Israel, and this is where it collapses. This is the cusp of greatness here. So he was a great king. And then it falls apart. Next king, Menahem, failure. He was forced to pay a high tribute to Assyria. Assyria kind of rises back up from the ashes. It worked out about $520 per man, which would be about $31 million in today's money. So that's a hefty tribute, so it shows the foreign policy was weak. Domestic policy, we don't have much history, but he seems to start out as a tyrant. He seizes the throne in the third month. He seizes the throne. He's the third king in 6 months. And basically any city that doesn't open the gates to him and welcome him as king, everybody's killed, including pregnant women. High taxation to appease the Assyrians. His name means comforter, though, which is interesting. So maybe his later policies were kind of a welcome stability to the situation, and maybe that strong arm of tyranny was a comfort to the people, but he was still a tyrant. He did bad, he continued doing what was bad. He wasn't better, he wasn't worse. Hosea's record kind of began in Jeroboam's reign, overlapped with Menahem's, so the murder and prostitution could have been Menahem's policy and not Jeroboam II's, but we don't know for sure. But rule of law had clearly broken down. We don't know much about his reputation. He wasn't effective, though. That's basically the point. When we don't know much either way, it means ineffective king. And Pekah, failure as a king, foreign policy, massive loss of land to Assyria, Naphtali, Asher, Zebulun, maybe Dan is all exiled. Dan might have remained till the end, though. He attacks Judah in an effort to kind of pull himself together and salvage his kingship, which he attacks Judah. He destroys the army. It's a massive victory for him. They return with captives of war, big victory. And he kills some of Ahaz's sons, which, again, between Pekah killing some of the kids and Ahaz sacrificing other kids in the fire, this sets up Hezekiah. So it's interesting. Domestic policy is zero. I mean, economic collapse, poor tax policies, civil war, massive migrant problem because of being taken over by Assyria and exiled. This is going to lead to economic collapse and all these sorts of things. So terrible domestic policy. Spiritual policy, ineffective. Give him some points because he listened to the prophets and returning the prisoners of war, but he was assassinated. And he was held liable for all the losses of Assyria, so people didn't view him well. And this gets us to the last king, Hoshea, which obviously failure. If he's the last king, he's a failure. Foreign policy, he stopped paying tribute to Assyria, which again, it's like Hezekiah, what are you thinking? He started conspiring with Egypt, which again, what are you thinking? And this brings the final blow from Assyria, the siege of Samaria, the fall of Samaria, a horrendous end to the nation. Domestic policy, I mean, obviously, everybody died. It's not that good. Spiritual policy, 2 Kings 17:2, he wasn't the worst, but that's the only place he gets points. He wasn't the worst. And reputation, I mean, he was a guy that the nation was destroyed under, so here's a failure. So that's it. So if you go through the ranking kind of from 1 down to 30, which you see there, top 10, Jehoshaphat number 1, David number 2, Saul number 3, but number 3 is tied. Saul, Josiah, Uzziah, Jeroboam the second, tied for 3rd place. Asa at number 7, Jotham at 8, Jehoash at 9, and Omri rounds up the top 10. Hezekiah, 11th, sorry, doesn't crack the top 10. It's just too many people died. You can't be a good king if you have that many people dying. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Maybe a different take and a different view on some of these kings, looking a little bit more in depth on what it was like living there. Maybe you put them in a different order. I'd love to hear what your top 10 is and why the top 10 would be different, where you would put some of these guys like Jeroboam II being in the top 10, Saul being in the top 3, but then Hezekiah being in the top 20. Maybe you would move it around. Love to hear from you. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Again, check out Taste and See TV, drinkoffering.tv. We also do in-person tours, drinkofferingtours.com. If you're coming to Israel, look us up. We'd love to take you around and go really in depth on these sites. Have a lot of fun. Our motto is see the land with drink in hand, so we provide refreshments. It'll be enjoyable. It's about making the Bible fun and education fun. And so check out more of what we do. Check out our shop. Get some great Bible swag and t-shirts also. And we'll catch you again on another Behind the Research or Taste and See TV.